Sometimes you want a method's arguments to be optional. You could achieve this by creating overloads for every possible combination of arguments, but that's an inefficient way to deal with the problem. You can create optional arguments by giving them a default value, which they will use automatically unless a value is provided. To begin this lesson, open the Textland solution from your sample files folder. And open encryptionfunctions.cs from the Encryption Library project. Now remove the second overload for the encryptString method. You're going to replace this overload's functionality by making the encryption key and initialization vector arguments optional. You learned about overloads in Lesson 4.6. Now make the encryption key and initialization vector arguments optional by changing the code that begins the encryptString method to public static string encryptString string to encrypt byte encryption key equals null byte initialization vector equals null. The encryption key and initialization vector arguments are now optional. If you call the method without specifying an encryption key or initialization vector, these arguments will take the default values of null. You're going to need to modify the method to work with the new optional arguments. Change the code aesalgorithm.key equals encryption key to if encryption key equals null aesalgorithm.key equals encoding.utf8.getBytes learn ASP.NET, C# and Visual Space Studio ! Else aesalgorithm.key equals encryption key. Now in the same way, change the code aesalgorithm.iv equals initialization vector to if initialization vector equals null aesalgorithm.iv equals new byte 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 11 12 13 14 15 16 else aesalgorithm.iv equals initialization vector. This method will now use this default encryption key and initialization vector if one isn't specified. Now open the code behind file of encryption.aspx and you'll notice that there are no errors. The call to encrypt string still works correctly with a single argument. Let's examine the IntelliSense information for your method. Add a new line to the button encrypt click event handler and type encryption library .encryption functions .encrypt string begin brackets. Optional arguments are shown in square brackets. Also notice that there are no longer any overloads for your method. You might be wondering what you'd need to do if you wanted to specify an initialization vector but not an encryption key. When calling a method with multiple optional arguments, you'll sometimes want to specify only one of them. You can do this by specifying the argument by name. This is called a named argument. Here's an example of how you'd call the encryptString method with just the string to encrypt and initialization vector arguments. encryptString textboxencryption.text initialization vector : initialization vector. For completeness, you could call both arguments by name, using the code encryptString string to encrypt : textboxencryption.text initialization vector : initialization vector. You can use this technique with any method. This is sometimes useful to clarify which argument is which. Remove the code that you've just added and test your code by viewing encryption.aspx in your web browser. When the page loads, click Encrypt, and the text is encrypted without any problems. Close your web browser now, and close Visual Studio. You've now completed Lesson 4.7. Add optional arguments to a method.